Okay, so last time the last lecture, we got to this part in the apology where Socrates is, he's just beginning his defense, right? We know the charges against, we covered that in the first lecture, right? He's being accused of not respecting the gods of the city, right? He's being impious. So impiety is one of the charges. And because of his behavior, and because the youth tend to follow him around and listen to him debating and questioning others, he's corrupting the youth, right? So those are the two charges that he's defending himself against: impiety, corrupting the youth. And he begins his defense with this story about how his journey began, and he thinks he knows why he has this bad reputation. These charges are false, of course. He wants to claim, but he knows why. He knows why. He knows why people are saying this, and so he wants to tell us his story. Someone's asking if they can screenshot. I don't care if you screenshot. Go ahead, screenshot all you want. As I said, this is being recorded, so I'll be posting it later on the website, so you can watch it and screenshot it all you want there. Dylan, you got your hand raised. Do you want to jump in real quick?
Oh, yes, sir. What day did we go over the first part of the apology?
That was on Tuesday, right? So on Tuesday, I record lectures at 11 a.m. for my 11 a.m. And then on Thursday, I record a lecture at 1 p.m. And you're welcome to go to both of those lectures if you want. They're optional, right? So I put a link. I know some of you probably have a class at 11. You can't make the 11 a.m. one. But yeah, so on Tuesdays, I record a lecture at 11. And on Thursdays, I record a lecture at 1 p.m. at this time. So this is part two. I'm doing a little bit of review just to sort of get us up to speed. But yeah, and I will be posting these lectures the day they're recorded. It probably will take me a while, to get them converted and uploaded and all that. But by the evening, by Tuesday evening, the Tuesday lecture should be posted on our website. And by tonight, this lecture will be posted on our website. So
Okay, so we have to watch. We have to find time to watch both.
right, and at your own time, really. All class meetings are optional, basically, right? Like you don't have to come to any of
Oh,
them, right? You're able to, you're gonna get a bonus point for showing up to any lecture. You get 1 point, and if you show up to the Q&A sessions, right? There's a Q&A session. We'll meet like we normally would. We'll meet on Tuesday at 1 p.m. for Q&A, and if you come with some good question and discussions, then you can get more bonus points for that. But just simply by showing up to these, you get 1 point. Um, right, exactly. Tamaya has it in the chat box. Tuesdays, that's our Q&A session. That's our discussion. So, we can discuss whatever reading we happen to be covering that week. We can discuss, any papers that are coming up. It'll be open to anything. This is more for a format, right? This is more like, show up on Thursday. I'm just going to lecture about the apology. Feel free to interject like you just did if you have a question, but it's basically me laying down a lecture to post on Blackboard. And you can watch it anytime you want. You don't even have to show up now if you want. Since you're here, I would recommend you stay in and get in for to get your bonus point. But that's basically how the logistics works. I thought I had explained this about 20 times already, and I posted it on Blackboard, but apparently maybe it'll take us a few weeks to get used to this schedule. And this, here's the reason I'm doing this. I could do 2 lectures in a row that are the same exact lecture and stress myself out. And I'm just telling you, I did that last semester and it nearly killed me. Okay, I thought I kind of explained this on the first day of class, but maybe I need to explain it again. I'm experimenting. This is an experiment. Nobody seemed to have any problems with it. If you don't like it, I mean, we can talk about it after class, but right now I'm sticking with it. But everybody seemed to be cool with it. Or maybe they still don't understand what's going on. But again, let me try to explain it again. On Tuesdays, this class does not have to meet. It's a Q&A session. On Thursday, I will record a lecture. You don't have to show up to any of those, okay? For my 11 a.m. class, it's the reverse. For my 11 a.m. class, on Tuesday we have a lecture, and on Thursday we have the Q&A. All students for both my sections are free and open to join me at any one of those meetings. You have all the choice in the world or not show up. Okay, so that's how this class is running. Okay, I think it's going to be less stressful for me. It's going to make me a happy professor. I think it'll be less stressful for you. It is confusing, I admit it, but I think after the first couple of weeks you'll get used to it. I hope. All right. Anybody else got any other questions? I hope that clarifies it. I hope that's the last time. Now it's on tape and now it's recorded, and I can post it on Blackboard, and maybe people will watch the video. And hopefully this is the last time I have to explain the logistics of this class. But it seems like Tamaya's got it. She in the chat box. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat box, and no one else is raising their hand. So I'm gonna assume I'm ready to rock. Okay, I'm ready to rock. Okay, so let me jump in. And in fact, sorry guys, I just realized I got no water, so I'm gonna pause the video right now. And again, we're dealing with now's the first reading. We're dealing with the apology. We got just barely into it last lecture. We talked about the charges against. What is he being accused of? And his basically like beginning of his defense. He's talking about this. I don't know what you call it. Investigation of his, right? That's how I sort of characterize it, because he heard something about himself. Remember, I talked about this the last lecture. He heard that the oracle at Delphi had said that he's the wisest, or at least that there are none wiser than him. And he didn't really quite believe this at first. He thought this was crazy. How could Socrates be the wisest? He was very aware of his own ignorance, and that there were many things that he didn't understand. But he knew that the oracle often spoke in riddles. So he said, there must be some deeper meaning to this. Maybe there must be something to this saying. The oracle would not lie. I remember, we covered this last time. The oracle is speaking for Apollo. At least that's what the Greeks believed. The ancient Greeks, they thought that these oracles, these priestesses, basically had this direct connection to the gods. And this particular oracle had a connection with Apollo. And Apollo was the god of sun and sunlight and truth and wisdom, and he hated lying. So the oracle at Delphi was often considered like one of the most important, and if the oracle at Delphi said it, it must be true. So he takes it serious. He's like, well, geez, it must mean something, but there must be some deeper meaning. He was well aware that the oracle would often speak in riddles and not be very clear. There'd always be some different ways to interpret. I mentioned last time about the Greek king who decided he wanted to go invade the Persian Empire. And he asked the oracle if he should do it. And he was told that if he invaded the Persians, that a great empire would fall. But he took that to mean a good thing. But actually, when he went to go invade their empire, his empire fell. So Socrates thought, okay, what's going on here? I've got to investigate. So how does he investigate? He goes looking for people who he considers, or at least who are considered by others, to be wise. And, this is the quote. I think I read this quote at the end of the lecture last time, but I'm going to begin this lecture right where we left off to sort of get us resituated. But he starts with the politicians, what he calls, I'll read the passage here in a minute, he calls our public men. He starts with them, but he goes to three different groups, right? He starts with the politicians, he moves on to the poets, he moves on to the craftsmen, and in each situation, he realizes that in some sense, he is wiser than them. So let's read a little bit here and see how does this investigation unravel, and what does he discover about his wisdom. And if you have the handout here, it's I guess it's page number 24. Some of you might be looking at different versions. So if you got a different version, it's line. Hold on a second. It's line 21B in the margins. It's at the bottom of the page. He says, "Consider that I tell you this because I would inform you about the origin of the slander." Right? Where does this bad reputation come from? Why are these people slandering me? Let me tell you. Here's where it started. He says, right? When I heard of this reply, when I heard the oracle say that I was the wisest, I asked myself, whatever does the god mean? What is his riddle? I'm very conscious that I'm not wise at all. What then does he mean by saying that I am the wisest? For surely he does not lie. It is not legitimate for him to do so. So for a long time, I was at a loss as to his meaning, and then I very reluctantly turned to some such investigation as this. I went to one of those reputed wise, thinking that there, if anywhere, I could refute the oracle and say to it, this man is wiser than I, but you said I was wisest. Then when I examined this man, there's no need for me to tell you his name. He was one of our public men. My experience was something like this. I thought that he appeared wise to many people and especially to himself, but he was not. I then tried to show him that he thought himself wise, but that he was not, and as a result, he came to dislike me. And so did many of the bystanders. And so I withdrew and I thought to myself, I am wiser than this man. It's likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile. But he thinks he knows something when he does not. Whereas when I do not know, neither do I think that I know. So I'm likely to be wiser than he is to this small extent, that I do not think I know what I do not know. After this, I approached another man, one of those thought to be wiser than he, and I thought the same thing. And so I came to be disliked both by him and by many others. So he goes around asking questions to first the public men, the politicians, and what is his experience? Okay. They appear wise to themselves and to others. This is this distinction that I pointed out in the last lecture that runs throughout Plato between being very persuasive and appearing correct, but what's really true. So these politicians seem to be smart. They talked a good game, I guess you could say. But when you really broke down the promises they were making and the things they were saying about how they were going to run the city and all the things they were going to do, when you question them and you ask them about things like justice, Socrates says, well, it turns out that they appeared to be wise, but they weren't, that they thought they knew things that they didn't know. And so I, Socrates, must be wiser than them to this small extent, right? That I don't think I know something when I in fact don't. So the politicians didn't like this. They got pretty angry with him, and so he moved on to the poets. So what happens with the poets here, right? It's a little different. There's a similar theme you're going to see throughout all of these encounters. But there's something a little bit special, I guess, about what's going on with the poets. Let's read here. This is skipping forward a little bit there, line 22b. He says, after the politicians, I went to the poets, the writers of tragedies and dithyrambs. A dithyramb is it's like a folk song. They played it on a lyre or a lute, a stringed instrument, and it was a folk song to the god of wine and the god of sex and wine and pleasure, Dionysus. So kind of like the hippie rock star. So poets, the term poet really is a broad term in this context. We're talking about the Greek word poesis is to bring something forth, to create. And so what we're really talking about here in this context are the artists, the creators, the poets, the songwriters, the playwrights, those types. Maybe a modern day analog would be like the celebrities, the rappers, the rock stars and stuff like this, fashion moguls and such. So he goes to those type, right? Those who create, those who are, I don't know, maybe fashion mogul wouldn't be, that'd be more of a craftsman. It depends on who we're talking about here, designer, I don't know. But what happens with the poets is interesting. He says that He intended in their case to catch himself being more ignorant than they. But what happened? He says, I took up those poems with which they seem to have taken the most trouble, and I asked them what they meant, in order that I might at the same time learn something from them. I am ashamed to tell you the truth, gentlemen, but I must. Almost all the bystanders might have explained the poems better than their authors could. I soon realized that poets do not compose their poems with knowledge, but by some inborn talent and inspiration, like seers and prophets who also say many fine things without any understanding of what they say. The poets seem to me to have had a similar experience. At the same time, I saw that because of their poetry, they thought themselves very wise in other respects, which they were not. So there again, I withdrew, thinking that I had the same advantage over them that I had over the politicians. So what's going on with the poets? He's realizing that he picks, I guess, what he takes to be their finest works, their most brilliant works. Look at this play that you wrote, Euripides. It's so well crafted. It has such great moral lessons, and it gets at the heart of the human condition. What is it? What's the message? What are you trying to say? And Socrates, much to his disappointment, he discovers that the poets couldn't even explain their own poems, that they didn't even understand them themselves, and that the people who were just sort of standing around, I guess their fan club, all their big fans, they understood the poems even better than the poets did, the ones who wrote them. So he concludes that, well, how the hell are they able to write these poems that are so brilliant and full of wisdom if they don't even understand them? How is that possible? Well, he concludes that it must be inspiration, divine inspiration, just like the oracle is able to speak because the god inspires her, and she says many wonderful, wise things without really even understanding them. Uh, or either it's just inspiration, or you just have this talent, you're just born with it, you just know how to string words together, they sound great, and you don't even really know what you're doing. So if that's the case, we don't really have wisdom for Socrates. If you can't explain something, do you really know it? Do you really understand it? If you say many wise things, like let's say I give you guys a lecture on how to perform brain surgery, and I've never performed brain surgery in my life, and I don't know how to do it, but I memorize a lecture. I memorize it verbatim, step-by-step guide on how to perform brain surgery. And I'm using all sorts of medical terminology that I don't even understand, and all sorts of words that I don't even know what they mean. Do I have wisdom with regards to brain surgery? No. And so there seems to be this component in wisdom. Not only are you able to repeat and even do things that are good, you also have to know what you're doing in order to actually be wise and to be smart. You have to have understanding. And the poets don't have understanding, and so therefore Socrates wants to say that they don't have wisdom either. But because they're so popular and because their poems are so great, they get this arrogance about them, and they think they're wise when they're not. And so Socrates thinks he has an advantage over them that he had over the politicians, that he's aware that he doesn't know certain things, or many things for that matter. Socrates doesn't seem to be very confident about his knowledge regarding much. We'll talk more about that probably in the next lecture. But he seems to be rather agnostic about generally everything. Like, I'm not even sure. All I know is that it's good to know, and I want to be wise. But what happens when he gets to the craftsman? Maybe I should say something very briefly in defense of the poets before we move on to the craftsman. And if anybody else wants to jump in, feel free, by the way. Don't feel like you have to, just sit back and listen. If you want to ask a question or interject, feel free to do so. But again, I kind of want to come to the defense of the poets, and maybe this is because I'm a big fan of art and poetry and all that. That's kind of something that I'm keen on myself. Maybe I have a little bit of bias here. Certainly, though, I would say Plato and Socrates, or at least Plato for sure. Who knows about Socrates, but certainly Plato, the writer, he had a bias against poets, and perhaps this has a lot to do with the way he conceived of art and poetry. For him, art and most of what we would call art these days is simply imitation. You're taking, maybe you've heard the expression art imitates life. I don't know if this is for sure, but it's pretty likely that that goes back to the Greeks. It seems like both Aristotle and Plato, they both seem to believe that art was just a sort of mimesis. That's the Greek word, mimesis, to mimic, to copy. And so, you know, seeing something and drawing a picture of it, that's a copy of the actual thing. So it's a copy of the real, the actual thing. So if it's a copy, it's further removed from the truth. It's just appearance. There it is again, just appearing to be real, but not actually being real. So they were pretty suspicious. They were pretty, I think Plato for sure was suspicious against art and artists, and and sort of clamped down on it. He thought in his philosophy, you should clamp down on it and regulate it and be very restrictive of it if you want to have a good orderly society. And I definitely don't feel that way about it myself. So maybe I got my own bias in favor of art, but I think too, do you necessarily have to be able to explain something, or maybe you don't even want to explain something, like some artists, and this is a very modern view of art. Again, the Greeks thought of it, or at least these Greeks, Plato and people like Aristotle, um, they thought of art different. It's just a copy. It's just you're just copying nature, or you're adding, or mimicking nature. But what about art is just expression. And if I want to express something, or abstract art, like a beautiful painting that's just a bunch of like different colors and shapes and forms that elicits a sort of emotional response. And what about more open-ended art, where you just, like a movie that doesn't have necessarily a message? It's just even though it is a reflection of life, it's supposed to sort of be open to interpretation. Does there have to be one meaning or one way to interpret a certain poem? Maybe there are several meanings. And some artists, they I think they're very intentional with their work. I don't know, there might be some English creative writers in here, English majors. Um, some people are very intentional with their work. When they write something, they have a message that they want to convey. But some people are just they convey their experience of the world to others, and it's open to interpretation. It's not like they don't have an axe to grind. But I suppose that might be a very modern view of art, and maybe I'm being a little nitpicky here with Socrates, but I can't help but want to come to the defense of the artist. Mariah asked a good question here in the chat box. She says, according to Socrates, wisdom isn't just knowledge, it's also experience. That's a good question. Plato wrote several dialogues about knowledge and how you define knowledge. And it's not very clear how experience ties into it. It seems like we'll get into this in more detail once we finish the apology and once we actually move on to the symposium, particularly once we get to the end of the symposium with Socrates' speech. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but Plato seemed to be actually pretty critical of knowledge that was based solely on experience. If what you mean by experience is, just seeing it with your senses, seeing it, hearing it, to him, he seemed to think that experience was the beginning. It's where you start, but it's very insufficient. To have full knowledge, you have to understand something that underlies and what causes your experience. But I should just kind of leave it there. It's a good question. I don't want to dismiss it, but we're gonna get into that sort of stuff much later in the semester. Well, not much later, but probably sometime next week towards the end of the week. So I'll hold off on it. But it definitely, if you don't have experience of something and you can't talk about it in a way that reveals an understanding that can be applied in several different situations, then you don't really have knowledge of it. And so if a poet is able to just one off create a piece of art or poetry that is beautiful but doesn't know why they wrote what they wrote. I don't know why I said it that way. I could have said it another way. It just came out that way. Then for Plato or Socrates, they seem to be saying, well, they're not wise. That was just luck. That was just maybe inspiration. Maybe they were guided by the gods. They were guided by their emotions, but it wasn't. They weren't guided by their wisdom and their knowledge. And this is different when we get to the craftsman. It seems like I would say out of all three groups, they all are problematic. They all think they know things that they don't know. But it seems like he's more lenient on the craftsman than anybody else. For him, they do have some wisdom, and he actually does learn some things from the craftsman. I mean, what do you think he's going to learn from the craftsman? If you hung out with someone who is a craftsman for a few days, I mean, don't you think you would learn a few things? I hope, unless you just, like most of my students during class, just have your face down in your phone ignoring me. But if you were paying attention, you're definitely going to learn something, I would think. Probably, you'll learn about the craft. You'll learn about how to build a ship. If you go to the shipbuilders, you're going to learn how to be a blacksmith. You might not be able to do it yourself, but you'll learn a little bit about the trade. And I guess if you hang out long enough, maybe you will be able to learn it yourself and get the practice. So, Socrates seems to think that these craftsmen do have knowledge. But what's the problem with the craftsmen? Well, it's very similar to what happens with the poets. Because of their skill in poetry, they think that they are just wise in general. And so the craftsmen, because they are so good at fixing things or building things or designing things or whatever their skill is, whatever their techne is. I should write that Greek word here. They have knowledge of their techne. That's a Greek term it's often translated as craft or art or skill. There's different ways you could translate it, but it's just sort of anything that has rules, norms, regulations, a discipline, a field of study. They have knowledge of their techne. They have knowledge of their practical skill. But because of that, they think that they just should rule the world. And I think that this is something, this points to a kind of psychology, which I think is actually quite common. What Socrates is encountering here with the craftsman, I think is quite similar to I used to encounter this with, I have a brother-in-law. Well, I guess he's like an ex-brother-in-law now. My sister's divorced, but he was a computer nerd and he knew all this stuff about Linux networking, and he just was very condescending, and he thought he was so smart about everything. He's a pretty smart guy. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, he's a smart dude, but I think he thought, because I know how to run computer networks, I know all there is to know about politics, literature, and if I don't know anything about it, I just kind of roll my eyes about it because it's not even worth knowing. And I think, again, this is this kind of psychology that I think all of us can fall prey to, especially once we start to specialize. Once you start getting, into your major and you're starting to like take upper level classes and all these electives, and you're starting to like hang out with only other people in your field, and so only people you talk to are other psychology majors or math majors or whatever your major is, and you're using all these big words that no one else understands unless they're a part of your club. And so you tend to think of your skill as maybe even more important than it actually is. Not that it's not important, but you think, well, if I know how to do this, I should rule the city. I remember when I was an undergraduate, I worked at Whole Foods for heck like almost 9 years. So like from my like right out of high school, I started working in the meat department, the meat and seafood department in San Antonio, and then I transferred to Austin and just worked the meat department. But I worked there almost 9 years. But I'd worked there so long that I was able to fill in and just sort of fill in shifts and pick up shifts in all the different departments. And so I kind of got a firsthand experience. Mariah was talking about experience earlier. I got a bit of a taste of what it was like to work as a bagger or a checker, or to work in the wine and cheese department, or to work in the prepared foods or the produce. Like I kind of got the gist of it. And it was funny. I realized that everybody that worked there, except for like maybe the people in the what we called it the nutrition department back then, and now they call it whole body, like all the supplements and the soaps and bubbly bath stuff. They had it easy and they knew it. But everybody else thought that they had the hardest job in the store. They thought they had the hardest job, and they thought they had the most important job, like every one of them. And so I thought it was hilarious, because I remember I transferred to the front end to be a bagger and a cashier my last year working there, because I was so stressed out as a butcher, like cutting meat, and like, dude, it was physically grueling. It was a lot of heavy lifting, working in these really cold coolers, working with these huge, sides of beef. And it was a lot of work. I got, honestly, like, maybe I'm biased here, but I thought it was actually one of the hardest jobs in the store. Maybe there was like one or two others, like being a baker. I think that requires a lot of skill and timing. It's a different skill, but it's also difficult for other reasons. But I remember when I transferred to be just a bagger and a cashier, and people were like, "Why did you do that?" People on the front end were asking me, "Why did you transfer to the front end from the meat department?" And I told them, I was like, "Well, I'm going to school full time, I'm working full time, and I just been stressed out, and I need to like have some time. Like whenever I'm off work, I'm worrying about how I'm gonna like work all this meat into the case next shift, and it's like, yeah, I'm constantly worried about all this product." I was also like not just a team member, I was a buyer. I was like, forget this. I just want to ring people up. I just want to work at a cash register and bag groceries. And people couldn't fathom. They're like, it's harder to work in the meat department than to say paper or plastic. And I was like, yeah, it's like we got so much to do. But they would always assume like, well, we have to deal with customers, so it's worse. But I told them, look, we deal with customers, and we had to had steaks, and we had to fill the merchandising cases, and we had to cook. We had like a little barbecue section. We had to smoke meat, and we had to deal with customers at the same time. And so I think it's like people lose sight of the full picture, and they focus on their techne, their craft, and they tend to lose sight. What's the saying? They lose the forest for the trees, and they tend to elevate their own importance. And so this is what happens with the craftsmen. They're like, well, I'm the best blacksmith in my guild, so I could run the city. I know everything about everything. But it turns out that no. Just because you know how to build a nice boat, or you're able to forge a nice shield or sword or something like that, or dagger, that doesn't mean that you know how to run a city. That doesn't mean that you know how to organize and run a city and be a politician or whatever. And so we can see in all three cases here, Socrates is running into this issue where all these people, although they tend to have something to offer, except for the politicians, he doesn't seem to say much good about them. They don't really offer much except for lies and arrogance. But the poets have some good poems. The craftsmen have knowledge of their skill. But despite this, that makes them arrogant, and it gives them this hubris and this assumption of wisdom that is unfounded, and that Socrates lacks. He has humility, he's able to be humble, and he realizes that he doesn't know certain things, and there's a lot of things he'd like to know, and he's still asking these questions. Some have questioned Socrates' sincerity. Does he really think that he's, not wise? Is he really as humble as he acts? But certainly these groups that he's encountering, they don't seem to sort of get it, right? They seem to sort of be full of themselves and not really understand that they are misled or misinformed. I don't know, misinformed is the right word, but they are misjudging the extent of their own intelligence. So there's for those psychology majors, I know quite a few of your psychology majors, you might want to look up the Dunning-Kruger effect. I don't know if I can even spell that. Dunning, I think it's D-U-N, it's named after the psychologist or sociologist. Dunning-Kruger, I think that's how you spell it. But basically the notion is that the less you know about something, the more you think you know, or the less you're aware that you're an idiot about it. And so that's kind of, I think, how the people on the front end were about the meat department. They thought all you had to do was you know give a person a steak when they asked for it. I want a steak. Okay, here you go. I want some ground beef. Yeah, here you go. Like, they don't think oh, you've actually got to grind that beef. You actually have to cut those steaks. You actually have to carry 80-pound boxes of meat and over your head to the shelf when you're stocking, and then pull them off when you need to take a side out or whatever, a slab out. They don't know much about what it's like to work in that environment, so they just assume it's simple. It must be easy, right? And so again, the Dunning-Kruger effect is I forget exactly how it's defined, but it's the less you know about a particular topic, the more you think that you are an expert at it. Or it's almost I forgot who I got this from, but I remember some commentator using the example of when you go to visit your relatives during the holidays over Christmas or Thanksgiving dinner, and always the uncle or the cousin or whatever, the one who's the most angry and vocal about politics and about this is what the Republicans or Democrats or whatever their side is, they're the ones that are the most vocal and the most angry, but they know the least, right? They know the least about what's going on, right? They watch one talk show host and just believe whatever he says, right? So the less they know, the more expert they think they are, right? So you could argue that Socrates is discovering the Dunning-Kruger effect in 390 whatever 99 BC. So what is the moral of the story? We're gonna try to wrap things up here. I told you I was gonna try to end the lecture in about a 45-minute time frame. So we've got about 5 or 10 minutes to go. I want to come to a nice stopping point. So he sums this up, right? And we're gonna move on. Next lecture we're gonna do is we're gonna look at how he cross-examines Meletus. And when he does this cross-examination of Meletus is one of his accusers. It's a little bit more obvious what's going on there. It's a little bit more obvious how he's establishing a defense against the charges. Remember, he's being charged of impiety, not respecting the gods, and he's also being charged with corrupting the youth. It's not really obvious how this story he's been telling us so far is addressing those charges, although we'll talk about it in a minute. Maybe he kind of is addressing at least one of those charges with this story. But that's for next time. Next time we'll go to Meletus and the cross-examination. But let's try to come to a nice stopping point. Let's get to his kind of summation of this story and sort of what he comes to realize the oracle meant. Why did the oracle say that there were none wiser than Socrates? Well, this is at the bottom, or not the bottom. It's kind of in the middle, about a third of the way down on page 26. He says, as a result of this investigation, men of Athens, I acquired much unpopularity of a kind that is hard to deal with and is a heavy burden. Many slanders came from these people, and also a reputation for wisdom. For in each case, the bystanders thought that I myself possessed the wisdom that I proved my interlocutor did not have. Yeah, this is a typical problem of a philosopher. I always have this problem. It's always why I need to learn how to keep my mouth shut sometimes and just let people be wrong and just let them continue in their ignorance. Because usually, this happens in political when people are talking politics, and I'm like, that's not right what you just said, and here's why. And I explain to them why they're wrong, and they get really pissed off, like, well, then you just have all the answers. I'm like, no, I don't know what the right answer is. All I know is that that's not the right answer. You're acting like that's a simple solution, and I know why you think it's a simple solution, but you're not thinking about X, Y, Z, and all this stuff. And like, well, you're so smart, then what is your solution? I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. All I'm saying is we need to think about it some more. We need to think about it some more, because that's not enough, right? But, this is what happens to him. People think he has wisdom when he doesn't, because he keeps poking holes in all of their solutions, right? What is probable, gentlemen, is that in fact the God is wise, right? So Apollo is wise. He was right when he said that Socrates is the wisest. His response, his oracular response, meant that human wisdom is worth little or nothing. And then when he says this man Socrates, he's just using my name as an example, as if he said, this man among you mortals is wisest, who, like Socrates, understands that his wisdom is worthless. So even now, I continue this investigation as the God bade me, and I go around seeking out anyone, citizen or stranger, whom I think is wise. And then if I find out he's not, I come to the assistance of the God, and I show him that he is not wise. Because of this occupation, I do not have the leisure to engage in public affairs to any extent, nor indeed to look after my own. But I live in great poverty because of my service to the God. So what is the basic moral of the story here? He says that the God is just using him as an example. Socrates is no wiser than you and I, as long as we can be like him and realize what? We can realize that human wisdom is worth little or nothing. And so all you have to do to be just as wise as Socrates is to know what you don't know, to be aware of your own ignorance. And that's the one thing he has above all these others. Kind of a letdown, I guess, right? Wow, you're really wise because you know how stupid you are. It's pretty much the moral of the story there. I'm going to kind of end it there, but I need to stick around, and I need to take roll and make sure I give everybody credit for being here, because you're going to get the bonus point for attending the lecture. But I'll answer this question at the beginning of the lecture next time, but I want to ask it now in case maybe you guys kind of see where this is going. But how the heck has he done anything to help his case? How does this story help support his case? I mean, I'll leave it on an open-ended question, but talking about, I went to go talk to the politicians. I heard that I was the wisest, and I talked to them, and I realized that the only reason I'm wiser than everyone else is because they all think they know stuff they don't know. It seems like he's wasting time. Why hasn't he talked about impiety and why he's not impious, why he's actually pious? Why hasn't he talked about corrupting the youth? It seems like he's wasting time, but you could argue that no, this is actually a part of his defense, and that he's actually addressing the charges with this story. It's not obvious how he's doing it, but I think you could argue he's doing it. I don't think anybody has an answer. It's not an easy question, right? But think about that, I guess. Oh, Dylan's got his hand up. You want to take a shot at it?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm right, but I'll just say maybe he just. Yeah, I'm just trying. Maybe he's like, in order to prove himself right, you have to prove that they're wrong. I mean, of course it can't. Of course, you say maybe he's objective, correct? Was he objective or subjective?
Well, he's trying to be objective, right? He thought that there's an objective truth. Yeah.
So absolutely. So like that correlation. Before you can prove yourself right, you have to prove that somebody else is wrong, depending on your situation.
I'm glad you brought the objective subjective distinction, because I think, yeah, in a way he might be establishing that they're wrong, right? Because, and this is not so obvious in the reading, his three accusers, what is it, Anytus, Meletus, and Lysone, I think are their names. They all represent those three groups. They represent the politicians, the craftsmen, and the poets. So I think he's saying, look, like you said, they're biased. They have a subjective hatred towards me because I made them look bad. I made them look stupid. And so I think you're right. He's discrediting them, I think. So he may not be directly addressing the charge of impiety and corrupting the youth, but like you said, he's showing that his accusers they've got an axe to grind. They've got a bias. There's another reason though too, and maybe I'll leave this for next time unless somebody else has a guess. I think he's actually addressing the charge of impiety directly. He's actually showing that he's being pious. But anyway, I'll leave that for next time. I'm going to stop recording, and so I'll post this video in a moment once we get all logged off. But